What happens with Canadian art is that because Canada is a lot of land, you paint what your surroundings
Right.
are about. And landscape and the idea of the North and ruggedness and all that sort of thing
Right.
is part of the Canadian psyche. So
Right.
I think that you'll find landscape a dominant thing in Canadian art. Canadian art always will be influenced by the environment. Most people live in cities now. You have to also take a look at urban experience also.
Right.
One, two, three, four.
Good morning on this. It's rainy Sunday morning in Great Falls, and we've got Heather Smiley back with us to talk about Canadian female artists from the past, and some not too far past, but some more recent than others. But they've all passed on to the other side. And welcome, Heather.
Good morning. We started out with we're going to talk about Canadian art history, and I think I meant like, eek, where would you start?
Right.
And
And you
so
were so kind to kind of break it down. So there's going to be a multi-part. It'll be a little triptych or multi-pick. I don't know what the multi-tick. I don't know, but multiple series of looking at Canadian artists, and I'm looking forward to it. So today we're going to focus on some females, some lovely ladies from the past. What's the weather? I'm just going to say, what's the weather like there today for you? Because I'm always curious.
we are sort of tipping back into winter. I don't know if you've been following the news at all. We've just had the most astonishingly warm weather here for the past week. And, it was yesterday, the day before yesterday, I think
Yeah.
it hit the mid-teens in Toronto.
Yeah, that's
So it was
Celsius
like
for
50.
everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Celsius.
Yeah.
It could be what, like, I don't even know, like 50s, 60s
Yeah,
in
that's
Fahrenheit.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. Like we have no snow. It's all gone now. Even
Yep.
up on the ski hill, the
Uh-oh.
cross country ski hill where they don't make snow. They've just got a bare covering of icy snow. So it's definitely a weird winter here.
We got hit hard with some snow, and within a week it was gone. And then we had almost like tropical weather on Friday, and yesterday was nice, and now it's going to start to get a little cooler now. So I always love like just reviewing kind of the differences of weather, but it's going to be rainy and dipping something fairly warm during the day, but going into below freezing overnight. So rain and freezing temperatures is not fun to think about. So I hope the roads stay safe for both of us
Oh,
where
I'm
we
sure
are.
they will. No, I
Yeah.
actually don't mind that it tips back into cold weather
Yeah.
because you know that it's still going to be winterish until
Yeah.
April.
Yeah.
And I don't want, just as an example, they've started to
Oh,
tap
wow.
maple trees. So
That's too
you don't
early.
want trees budding out, and we have some tulips and
Tulips coming
daffodils
up.
that are coming up and snowdrops that are about to blossom, and you go like, no, just go back in the
No.
ground, stay there because it's going to turn cold again.
Yeah, I know. Cover them up. Poor little things. Anyway, there we go.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
the first thing that always comes up is Group of Seven and Emily Carr.
Yeah.
But there are, and just because of the attitudes towards women in the 1800s and 1900s and into this century, the changing attitudes, thankfully, um, there are women doing art in the late 1800s and in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on, who are doing really good art, but their work was overlooked. And so
Yeah.
that's why I wanted to bring up the name of Helen McNichol,
Yeah.
because she's getting more recognition now. Um, but like I say, I never heard the name until maybe about 10 years ago.
Now, I think she moved to England. Um, she
Yes.
had she had a short life. She died at 35, right?
Yes.
From
Yeah.
diabetes, the complications. So I don't know if maybe people consider her more of like a British artist or something, like they don't recognize it, or not even at that. I'm just trying to think of why she wouldn't be recognized. She set up. Am I correct in saying she set up the Royal Academy of Arts for Canada, or is that, am I getting it mixed up? I might be
I'm
getting it
not so
mixed up.
sure about that. She was recognized in Canada. Um, Eric Brown, who was the director of the National Gallery,
Yeah.
bought some of her works for the National Gallery. This is,
Oh,
quite
yeah.
early on.
Yeah.
So she was certainly recognized by him, but he was very good at of recognizing good artwork. For example, he was also the person who, um, one of the first people who, a national level at a very, a well recognized Emily Carr's work and purchased her work at a time whenever she wasn't as well regarded.
Right.
So, yeah, the thing I like about Helen McNichol's work is that it's so, the canvases just bring so much light. Like
They
all of
really
her
do.
paintings are about light and how light and color, and they just sing.
They do. I
And
feel, yeah, looking at her work, I feel like she's been a massive influence because I think a lot of people have copied that style, but without knowing necessarily where it came from.
well, it definitely comes out of that whole tradition of French Impressionism.
Hmm.
And well, it was, by the time she was learning about it in the early 1900s, before the First World War, um, it was established in Europe, but certainly not as well known in Canada. And so her work was way out in front of what was happening in Canada at the time.
Okay.
And of course, the other thing, she also had to overcome being deaf.
She was deaf. Okay. I
She
didn't
was
know
deaf.
that.
Yeah. She
Wow.
had scarlet fever as a child, and from when she was 2 years old. And so her hearing was profoundly affected. So um, that,
Interesting person.
yeah, interesting person. Some people have pointed out that the figures that you see in her canvases don't look out at the viewer, and also
Right.
don't seem to interact with each other. They seem to be isolated, and some people have connected the isolation of the figures with Helen McNichol's
Deafness.
possible isolation, just the isolation that
Sure.
deafness can impose on you.
Sure. I'm just looking at some of her works, and I think in the editing we'll pop some up. But nice family, kind of like women, depictions of women and children, um, and they're beautiful. They really are. Um, so she's Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah. So what I just so that people have a sense of her timing, she was born 1879 and died 1915. Um, and she passed in, she had moved to England, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
She was studying art
so
there,
she was
and
studying
then
art, and she
spent a bit
was
of time in France.
right.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Have you
just
seen? So she's at the. You didn't say not the Ontario Gallery of Art. You said the National.
National Gallery of Art in
Yeah.
Ottawa.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Well.
read that, and there is a growing recognition of her work. There, I was looking up sales, and one of her works was selling at Sotheby's, and it was, the projected price was in 250 to 350,000, and it actually went for just over 800,000.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
It's
So
going to start to, that's
so
amazing.
there is, I
Growing
think, a
interest.
growing recognition that she is an artist comparable to, let's say, Mary Cassatt.
Yes.
So there's just it's just one of those things that artists sometimes get overlooked, and she was out there doing, you know, beautiful beautiful works, um but just got she because they weren't
They weren't in the
group of
style
seven
that
kind of
people,
landscapes. Like the group of seven sort of is like the big glob of paintings, or like just overshadows all of Canadian art.
I think so. Because
And
when people think of Canadian art, they think of Group of Seven
yeah,
and
yeah.
Tom Thompson. And I'm just trying to think, like I think we're kind of, are we still there? Like I know we'll kind of bounce around as we talk about different artists, but are we still there with Canadian art? We're starting to see more recognition of other artists, I think, and there's new artists that people look to. But I think
Oh yeah.
we're we're still like Canada is synonymous with in Canadian art with Group of Seven.
There is that. It's sort of like, so, just like people think of Canada and RCMP guys in red serge uniforms, and
Yeah,
it's true, but it's also just like
yeah,
a tiny
right. It's not
fraction
everything.
of what. It's not
Yeah,
everything. It's not the whole thing,
yeah,
and
yeah,
you don't want to let that stand in for all
right,
of Canadian art. So
right. And I guess, but I guess I get, the appeal of the Group of Seven is that it's pretty unique to Canada.
mhm,
Um, and whereas like if you're drawing from Europe, then there's similarity there. Whereas like you're looking for something that is like just so nationalistic, um, that is could only really come from that country or something like that.
mhm.
Um,
And I
but
think what happens with Canadian art is that because Canada is a lot of land,
yeah,
if um, you paint what your surroundings
right,
are about,
right,
and landscape, and the idea of the North, and ruggedness and all that sort of thing
right,
is part of the Canadian psyche. So
right,
I think that's why you'll find landscape a dominant thing in Canadian art. Not
right,
necessarily just group of seven kind of stuff, but you'll find a lot of Canadian artists do
right.
go to landscape.
Yes,
On the other hand, we've got lots and lots. Most people live in cities now, so
yes,
there's that whole. You have to also take a look at all the art that comes out of the things that you find with a city,
right,
or the urban experience also,
right. Yeah.
and just art about people that has nothing to do with landscape. So I think Canadian art always will be influenced by the environment, and but it's not. Group of seven landscapes are not the only thing. Almost think of group of seven as being very Toronto centric kind of stuff, because it
Yes,
goes with people who live in Toronto and go up to their cottage in the Muskokas.
right,
And that's what that's what they
right,
think of when they think of group of seven.
right. And there's also like there's Canadians like in their environment, but then there's also Canadians and their interests, and you're still formed by being Canadian, um, and how you kind of absorb influences from other schools of art and that kind of thing, so that you can't help but express your nationalism, despite the influences. I would think anyway, because you're always trying to say,
Hmm.
well, what am I referencing? When you start to really uh, paint and create a lot, you say, well, what matters to me, and how am I going to own my art, but with the techniques that I've learned and that the influences that I like, which, you know, now Helen McNichol, where is she from? Is she from Toronto? Let me just see
Um,
here.
born in Toronto, but her family was part of the sort of Anglo elite in Montreal, and so she grew up in Montreal. That would
Oh,
be her
okay.
home city,
Yeah.
and so
Which
that
can kind of
and she
also explain the look to Impressionism and the French and European kind of influences too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and her
Yeah.
family originally came from, I think, England.
Yeah, she's an interesting mix. I'm glad
Yes,
you brought her to our attention. I'll have to keep my eye out for her. Was she very prolific? Did she have a lot of pieces out there?
she
Yeah.
did a lot of painting in her lifetime. She was fortunate that because she came from a wealthy family,
Yeah.
she was able to just spend all of her time painting.
Oh,
So
that's nice. Yeah.
she as she was growing up, her talent was recognized, and her parents, had her going
Yeah.
to taking art classes from a young
Yeah.
age, and then she went
Yeah.
on to just kept on studying art, and
Yeah.
she was able to just
Yeah.
paint until she
Yeah.
died.
Sure. Sure. And being deaf couldn't have been easy. I couldn't
No,
imagine losing my senses. And I think, gosh, of all of them, sometimes you think, what's the one that I could live without? And, maybe smell. I mean, we kind of went through COVID, so we all kind of lost our smell. But I just think I wouldn't want to lose my eyesight. I wouldn't want to not be able to hear things. But, anyway, so it's amazing.
that was one of the artists, and then Emily Carr. And I
Yeah.
don't think we could. Again, one of those real. She was a really interesting character.
Yeah.
Born in British Columbia
Yeah.
and lived on Vancouver Island. Her
Yeah.
dad was a reasonably successful businessman, so he had built this great big house. And Emily was the youngest of quite a few children. But her parents died when she was in her teens. And
Oh,
so
that's sad.
her older sister helped raise her, but apparently her
Mm.
older sister was very strict. So when
Mhm.
Emily was a teenager, she persuaded her guardian to let her go to California to
Oh,
study art.
wow.
And so she was in California for 3 years studying art until the money sort of ran out and she had to come back
Yeah.
home.
Oh, I like
And
her.
so, yeah.
She's fun.
So,
And she was born, I'm just it's just so cool because, we think, oh, we're the only people who do these kinds of things, but she was born 1871 and died 1945. So it's just kind of fun to look at, what it was like to be a youth during that time.
yeah. Yeah. So she
Yeah.
would be contemporaneous with Helen McNichol,
Right.
but fortunately lived a lot longer. Yeah,
Yes.
she came back to Victoria
Yeah.
and set up her own studio and taught art for a little while until she made
Yeah.
enough money, and she went to England to study.
All right.
And so over the years, she was back and forth between Canada and England and France studying art. She'd come back and make enough money and go back again. And whenever nowadays we just hop on a plane and go, but back then to get
No.
from Victoria over to England or France was a trek.
Yeah, you'd have to go across, you'd have to do a train, probably across Canada or something.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Or take a boat.
Or take a boat the other way in the other
Yeah.
direction.
Go around. I don't know if the Panama Canal was open at that time. So if you
Yeah, I don't
go
think
through
I don't know. That's right.
So yeah, getting to England at that point would have been taken a minimum of 3 weeks, I would think.
Right. Yeah, not a day.
Yeah,
Yeah.
not a day. No jet
Yeah.
lag.
Right. Right. But I love her kind of single-mindedness that she threw her life into art.
She did. Yeah.
Yeah.
She never married.
Yeah.
I don't know if she ever had. Um,
Any
um,
kids or anything?
no, she never had kids or anything like that.
Yeah.
Now it's interesting that at one point when she was, and she struggled. At one point
Yeah.
when she was
Sure.
in England, she was diagnosed with hysteria,
Oh,
and she spent a year in a sanatorium. So,
okay.
of course, hysteria covered any number of things at that time. Like,
It's like a nervous breakdown or something.
could be like a
Right.
nervous breakdown. At one time, if you had hysteria, you were, if you weren't just living life as what was considered like a normal woman at the time, that could be hysteria. So,
Yeah.
not being married could be a cause of hysteria.
Right.
So,
Instead of being married, being a cause of hysteria. Oh, that's funny.
no,
Yeah.
I just looked it up a little bit. Apparently, getting married and having sex was supposed to be a cure for hysteria,
Oh. Well,
as
there
opposed
you
to a
go.
cause of it. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so she came back to Canada, and at one point in, I think it was about 1907, she and her sister took a cruise up the BC coastline up to Alaska and back down.
Oh,
And she decided
beautiful.
that one of the things she wanted to do was to document what existed of indigenous villages along the
Okay.
coastline before they
Right.
disappeared entirely. Because of course
Right.
that was also the period when Canada was going full on with trying to
Mm.
assimilate or destroy
Mm-hmm.
indigenous cultures. Um, of course, that the totem poles, the potlatches, all that kind of thing. Disease was having uh, devastated those communities, just wiped out some of them entirely. And so that was one of the things that she decided that she wanted to do. And so she spent a lot of time sketching and painting the villages, the totem poles, um,
Yeah.
the longhouses, all that sort of thing. And so she just
Yeah, she
spent
preserved it. Yeah, she
she
spent her time
she
preserving it. Yeah.
yeah. Now there's been stuff that's come out in more recent years that in some cases some of her paintings were
Oh.
from photographs taken by other people.
Uh-huh.
They weren't her direct experiences, but she certainly did. It was a hard scrabble living for her. She didn't have an easy time. She kept a boarding house, but she also had essentially a horse and a little caravan kind of thing, or like
Yeah.
a trailer. And she would use that to travel around to the various villages and live out of this little thing and paint. So she was pretty eccentric by the standards of a very straight-laced 1910s, 1920s Canadian society,
Mm-hmm.
especially out in um, a place like Vancouver Island, which was very British, like was probably
Mm-hmm.
more British than England was at the time.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I'm just trying to, imagine somebody, a woman doing the same thing today, what it would look like. And I think it 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 is kind of, it's a freer world now, but it's still, um, people think that, happiness is being in a marriage. And um, uh, so I think it would still be kind of mysterious for a lot of people to say, oh, you're doing this by yourself. And people would be very curious. I remember when I was single and living in New York, and I went to it was like a business dinner, and one of the men's wives said, "Oh, you live in New York City, and is it just like Sex in the City?" Kind of thing. And I said, "Absolutely." Like, no, it's funny, when people think like, "Oh, how do women, get on with their lives alone?" And it's happier. It's not necessarily wrong, but just happier if you are, in a traditional kind of family unit or something like that. So I think, there's still something like that today. And so I admire Emily Carr for really, I think she really followed her true north, long before it was really, commonplace, and before
Yeah.
the 60s and 70s really honored that,
Hmm.
like as individuals,
Yeah.
free individuals to kind of do that. So that's really cool.
Yeah. She needed that independence to do her art, but I'm
Hmm.
sure that, and I think she was by nature a very independent person, but
Yeah.
it still takes a lot of courage to say, I'm not going to follow the mold that everybody would like to put
Right.
me into.
Well, I guess too, when you're kind of the youngest of a big family, there's already been people who have fulfilled certain duties and responsibilities, like in certain roles, like, oh, they've all gotten married and done that, and now she doesn't have that sense of duty to her family to kind of do that because that's all been done,
Hmm.
and she's got more freedom maybe to do that. And so I'm just trying to climb into the mind of it, and it's interesting. That's all to contemplate and ponder. What were her interactions like with the group of seven?
Up until late 1920s, she had no contact with them at all.
Okay.
They weren't terribly aware of her. She wasn't terribly aware of them.
Oh,
But Eric Brown, name
yeah,
comes up again,
yeah,
um, did see some of her work and bought some for the National Gallery, and then said, "You need to talk to these guys in the group of seven."
yeah.
I'll just backtrack a little bit. She put together, as a result of all of the work that all the paintings she did along the coast of BC, documenting what she thought were, in her eyes, she was documenting the villages and the people and
Hmm.
the totem poles and so on. And she put together a great big exhibition in the around 1920. I'm not going to go and check back on my dates right now, but around
Sure.
that time. And it didn't meet with much success. And she tried to convince the BC government to purchase some of the works. They wouldn't have anything to do with it because her style, they didn't think that her style was documentary
Gotcha.
looking enough. By that point, she was painting in a much more modern style, more along the lines of fauve with
Okay.
brighter colors and very expressive gestures and stuff like
Right.
that. So that just
So it's
wasn't.
too artsy.
It was too out there for
Hmm.
the tastes at the time,
Hmm.
and so she was very discouraged. And for a long time, she considers herself quite a failure as an artist.
Mm.
But then Eric Brown saw her work and encouraged her, put her in touch with the group of seven. And within a fairly short period of time, she met most of the people in the group of seven and went to Montreal and sort of started being in contact with everything that was going on with
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
And so formed a strong friendship with Lauren Harris, who
Okay.
was really the leader of the group of seven, because he was aside from being an excellent painter, he was also a very thoughtful person, very reflective and encouraging of art. So
Mm.
um, that was a huge boost for her. And that's whenever she really went into her most productive period in the late 20s and early 30s. And with that encouragement from the people in the group of seven and recognition of what she was doing. That's sort of what Emily Carr was about. And then, unfortunately, in 1937, she had a heart attack, a
Oh.
major heart attack, and she wasn't able to paint after that. She continued to
Oh.
write because that was
Yeah.
something that she also did. She always kept diaries and wrote all the time. And between 1937 and 1945, wrote a couple of books, more
Yeah.
kids' books, but
Yeah.
still, and books about her experience. So she was just one of those people for whom writing and painting were her, that was her life.
Yeah. Well, Matisse also, he wrote as well, I believe. So he was a artist and writer.
Yeah,
I'm sure I'm sure many of them. So that's interesting.
yeah,
Then we go on to the third name that you came up with was Joyce Wyland.
yes,
And she was born in 1930. So there's not really that much overlap because she was just a baby when all this
yeah,
other stuff was going on.
yeah. I've chosen Joyce Wyland because, again, she's a prolific artist who worked across a range of media
Yeah.
and was immensely creative. I wouldn't say she's overlooked, but she's not. She needs to continue to be recognized. Let's put it that way, as a strong voice in Canadian art. So she was born in 1930.
Yeah.
Her parents died when she was fairly young, and both parents died.
Mm.
And she had some older siblings, and so they somehow or other managed to hold things together. But they were it was pretty hard scrabble for them. And she went to Central Tech High School in
Yeah.
Toronto, and for I'm sure I don't know if you recognize Central Tech.
My dad went there.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Central Tech was where you
yeah.
went if you wanted to
Yeah.
study art.
That's right.
And so there's so many Canadian artists who went through Central Tech, and she went there to study fashion. Started out in fashion design,
Yeah.
moved over to graphic design,
Yeah.
finished high school, and went to work as a graphic designer. Like she was just like
Yeah.
straight out of the gate.
Yeah.
Graphic designer,
Yeah.
eventually had her own studio and continued to do her own artwork while she
Yeah.
was doing graphic design and making a living. And in 1956, she married Michael Snow, who is
Yes.
another very well-known Canadian artist. And
Yeah.
she was just, she was going gangbusters. Isaac's Gallery in Toronto picked her up as a painter, recognized the quality of the work that she was doing then.
Right.
And then in 1961, she and Snow moved to New York City. And she was living in New York City, working as an artist. And now she wasn't just painting; she was doing she was taking in all the stuff that was going on with pop art and conceptual art at the time, and
Yeah.
incorporating that into the works that she was doing. So she was painting, she was making collage, assemblages,
Yeah.
just everything that was going on, filmmaking. And she was actually better recognized internationally as a filmmaker than
Oh.
as an artist.
Huh.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
She moved. Yeah. She moved in 1962 to New York City. So she was there in the 60s.
yeah,
Which is a great time. And I'm just, what kind of paintings did she do?
her works from the 50s and 60s are abstract,
Mm.
but they have parts of them feel like they incorporate aspects of body. They feel very human, I think is the
Okay.
best way to put it. Almost sometimes almost fleshy.
Okay.
Uh, and some of them are just like beautiful central images. Some of them are like set up almost like a series. For example, there's one painting that springs to mind that it's done in greens and flesh tones. And there's this it's like a repeated image.
Yeah.
It looks like at various times like a hand or a flower or like a penis. And it just,
Yeah.
the images just keep evolving, and they're just she's just such a luscious painter.
Uh-huh. Yes.
But she also she worked in quilts. One of her best known pieces is called Reason Over Passion, and it's a great big quilt with stuffed letters, like puffy letters. So
Yes.
it's got this
I'm
message,
I'm
reason
looking at
over
it now.
passion. There we are,
Yeah.
reason over passion.
Yeah.
But but the materials of the piece are about passion. So reason is stuck in there as a word, and it is over passion, but
Yep.
passion surrounds reason.
Right. And I saw that she actually did, I think it was it horses, like a horse scene in fabric. So same kind of like quilted thing, but for the one of the subway stations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she did a lot of quilted work. Especially in the 60s and 70s, she was doing
Yeah.
a lot of work about Canadian identity.
Yes.
And so not group of seven kind of thing, but Canadian identity personified in people and animals. And so she did a whole series of quilted cushions with these hand painted images on the cushions. They're not really like not cushions you could use in your living room. They're like little round pillows
Mhm.
about the size of your head, maybe a bit smaller
Yeah.
than that.
Yeah.
And so she was just so far ranging in the media that she used. She just took whatever happened to work for what she wanted to
Yeah.
express. And
Just
then,
yeah.
yeah. And she made a movie it was in the 70s, came out in 1976 about Tom Thompson. As a movie, it was a flop,
Okay.
but it explored some interesting ideas about Tom Thompson and love of wilderness, and it was entirely mythical. She brought in characters that didn't exist and all that sort of
Oh,
thing.
okay. Because it says she was
But it,
experimental
she
filmmaking.
was
So
she was very
yeah.
experimental.
Yeah.
And then in the 1980s, she went back to painting, and
Huh.
she had um, she just had, she was just fundamentally an extremely gifted painter. So
So she spent, you said, I think 10 years in New York City
yeah.
and then went back in 70, I guess early 70s.
Mhm.
And that's interesting because we were talking earlier before I started recording about New York and kind of the excitement of New York for me
Mhm.
that you see. I don't know what you don't see in New York, So it's it's you've got all sides of everything kind of thing. You've got new money, old money. You've got big money. You've got poverty. You've got artists. You've got corporate. You've got all kinds of just so much going on in one little
Mhm.
place. And it's electrifying, and that's what I love about it. And it's humbling because so many people are doing such interesting things, and you're saying, well, how do I fit in? And it really makes you kind of say, like, what am I doing, and what's original,
Mhm.
what's original about me, and everything like that. So did she come back from New York kind of changed in terms of like just, I mean, she's going to be changed because it's just a passage of time, and new experiences are going to do that no matter what. Did she feel like she has more of a New York kind of feel about her, or is she still Joyce from Canada with some experience, some time in New York? And did she kind of get bigger in terms of her view, or it's kind of hard to say, like, what the impact of New York would have been on her coming back, but I don't know, or maybe it is explicit. I'm not sure.
Well, I think in the early 60s, you would go to New York City because that was where everything was happening. And if you were, you know, William Ronald, another Canadian painter, and other
Yeah.
Canadian painters went to New York City because if you wanted to really prove yourself as an artist, you would make
Mm,
it in New York City. If you made it in New
gotcha.
York City, you had made it. You were on
Okay.
top of the world. And so
Okay.
that's what she and Michael Snow were doing. They were going there to say, like, I'm ready to take on New York City. And they
Gotcha.
were quite successful there,
Yeah.
both of them.
So they did
They
it.
were shown
Yeah.
at they had dealers and they were showing and things were going well. One of the things that, of course, was happening, though, in the 1960s was that growing opposition to the Vietnam War
Right.
and the inherent conflict that was coming up there with, they were quite left wing and certainly opposed to the Vietnam War. the other thing that was happening in Canada, of course, in 1967, you had Expo 67, and there was that great, sort of that recognition, sort of like, yeah, we
We're on the
don't
map.
have to be second fiddle to Britain or the US. We have our own identity, and we have pride in our identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so both Michael Snow and Joyce Weiland were very aware of that. Joyce Weiland in particular, she really took on the whole thing about Canadian identity. And so they left New York City not because they thought they'd done everything, but I think they felt that it was not the right place for them anymore. And so
Okay.
they came back to, that's why they came, I think that's why they came back to Canada, that they just fundamentally couldn't agree with some of the stuff that was going on in the US at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that was the time we had quite an influx of American draft dodgers coming to Canada who brought their own influences. That's a whole other
Right.
story right there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
So
think it was just coming back to Canada because that was that sense that, yes, I am Canada. I've gone and proven myself in New York, but now
right.
I'm going to come back and just
Yeah.
be here as
And
a
there's
Canadian artist.
right. And there's other things that are happening that are saying, Canada's relevant. So, so they've got their chops, and so they're bringing it back, kind of thing. I can understand that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Now I'm curious about like Michael Snow's work, and I'm gonna look into all of them a lot more. Like, I mean, Emily Carr, we grow up knowing Emily Carr, and it's funny because I do remember her growing up. First, I knew her as a writer, and then I said, "Oh, she paints too." so
Yeah.
so that makes sense when you said she wrote, children's books and that kind of thing. I did know her as a writer first. All of these people are really interesting, and I'm going to check out to see Helen McNichol a little bit more too.
Yeah.
Because she sounds. I did when I took a look at her. I said, "Oh, it really is luminous work,"
Yeah.
and just going to kind of look at it a little bit more closely and see what I can see. Look to see what she draws from, and then what's her also, what she's bringing out from herself and that kind of thing. So yeah, no, it's great.
Yeah, and definitely take a look at the Joyce Weiland's work. There's such an astonishing range in her
Yes.
work.
And that's exciting. Like, I actually have met so many people who, and maybe it's a woman thing that we just have so many things, that we have going on. I don't know. I'm sure there's men as well. This must just sound like such a pro-feminist piece of, of interview here, but it's not. I'm just trying to think because I'm thinking of I'm relating myself to these other women, and I've got so many different interests, and so somebody like Joyce, I go, well, that's really cool because we're doing these, I have an interest in doing these interviews, these podcasts. I like to write, I like to paint, but yeah, so I'm definitely going to look at Joyce Weiland. I'm so curious to see all the stuff that she's done, and to look at her, before New York, during New York, and after New York. And what a rich person. These are all very rich people to look at,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I really appreciate that.
So that's your little dose of Canadian art history for the week.
That's awesome. I love it. So that's wonderful. I'm happy with this. I mean, I'm just kind of now itching to kind of go look around some more and research some of these people on a nice Sunday afternoon. So do you have any?
Yeah.
What are your plans for today?
I have to do a little bit of visiting. I've got one of my kids I need to catch up with, and then I'm
Yeah.
going to pop over and visit my neighbor across the street.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting connection
Yeah.
for you.
Okay.
Talking about Canadian art. My neighbor's son has recently started going out with a woman whose uncle was Harold Town. Now, Harold
Okay.
Town was one of the uh, one of the leading members of a group of Canadian painters called Painters 11 from the
Okay.
1950s. And he was just an immensely prolific artist. So, who, of course,
Very
knew Michael
cool.
Snow and Joyce Wieland. So there we are. There's our connection. There's a connection
Wow.
to.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
And is she an artist?
She is.
She is an artist. Oh, that's
She is an
wonderful.
artist.
I just thought, no, it got lost. I'm waiting for okay, that's fine. It went somewhere else. Oh, very cool.
So,
wow.
That's so one of the things I'll be, I in the course of looking up some of the stuff about art, I came across this comment by Harold Town about some other artist who was dissing his work.
Uh-oh.
And essentially said, I didn't even realize he was still dead. Essentially, or he was dead, that he wasn't dead, or I thought it was, his art was, anyway. I'm messing
Something
it up totally, but anyway, it was a very, very witty put down of another artist who was dissing him. So, yeah, Harold Town was one of the very, I remember reading about him in the 70s, and he was one of the best of the Painters 11. He was flamboyant and eccentric, and definitely lived life on his own terms. And so anyway, it's interesting that now his niece is dating my neighbor's
Your
son.
neighbor's son. It's all coming. Well, these are great names. Eric Brown, I'm going to have to look him up as well. He sounds very interesting.
Very, very interesting man. Thank goodness for Eric Brown, because without him, the National Gallery wouldn't be what it is today.
Now Harold Town, and I'm going to be looking up Joyce Wieland and Michael Snow, along with Helen McNichol.
And that's going to, it's and then just everything that was happening in Canadian art in the 50s and 60s, and onwards. It's just the 50s and 60s were an explosion in the Canadian art world.
Yeah. Not just a group of 7. And thank you again. And we'll see you next time.
All right. Okay. Take care, Savannah, and we'll talk to you again
too.
soon.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.